Hey everyone, so in today's video I will be talking about how I fertilize my plants. Now, fertilizing and fertilizers is a pretty big topic, and in this video I will only scratch the surface, and I will make another more detailed video probably in the dead of winter when we don't have that much to do outside. But today's video is literally about how I fertilize my plants right now in the peak of the season. And I will start with summer blooming annuals, which I mostly have in pots like these right here or window boxes. So for those plants, I use this Jack's Blossom Booster fertilizer. This is a synthetic fertilizer, and it has been working for me really well. I fertilize my annuals once a week on Friday. I call them Fertilizer Fridays. And what I do is I dilute this fertilizer in water, and I just go around and I fertilize my plants. Now, the important thing to remember about synthetic fertilizers is that they can burn your plants. So there are a couple of things that you need to do. Make sure that your plants are well watered before you fertilize them. So don't fertilize your dry pots or dry window boxes. Just water them before that. And definitely do not over fertilize. Just follow the instructions on the back of this bucket or whatever the fertilizer you decide to use, because if you've over fertilized, you can burn your plants. In fact, I got a couple of messages from people who fertilize their plants with synthetic fertilizer, and the following day they just have gone yellow and wilted, and it was an obvious sign of plants being burned. And in that case, you can actually kind of flush out the fertilizer from the soil or the potting mix by using clear water. Just put clear water in the watering can or use a watering hose and just flush out all of the excess fertilizer from the window boxes or the containers. That will definitely help. Now let's talk about the plants in the ground in the garden. I don't use synthetic fertilizers in the ground because they tend to harm microbiome, mycorrhizae, and create salt deposits. So I use organic fertilizers like these right here. I don't have any preference. I'm not married to any of these brands. However, the Ispoma brand has this Velcro closure that I really like. It's those little things that matter because they're easy to open and easy to close. The Dr. Earth, which is also a great fertilizer, the closure and opening is a little bit difficult. But all of these fertilizers are great. They're made from organic products, like animal products like chicken manure or bone meal, or plant products like alfalfa. But before I use these fertilizers in the garden, I amend my soil either with compost or hardwood mulch or wood chips or leaves, or I just use the actual perennials, and I use a method that is called chop and drop. I chop them up and I leave the perennials on the ground. So that is feeding the soil that will eventually feed the plants. And I think that's something to think about, is that you actually want to feed the soil first and all of the microorganisms that live in the soil, and then the soil will feed the plants for you. There are different plant categories in my garden that I fertilize differently. So for example, the sidewalk garden, I only amend the soil there in the beginning of the spring because most of the plants there are native, so they don't like a lot of fertilizer. And the only thing I use is compost, hardwood mulch, or I do chop and drop like I mentioned. So native perennials do not like to be over fertilized. In fact, if you do fertilize them too much, they will become really leggy and will split. Now, there are some perennials that are interplanted in my garden beds that are heavy feeders, like roses, peonies, dahlias. Dahlias are now perennials in our zone, and garden phlox. So interestingly, garden phlox is a native perennial, but from my experience, they just need a lot of food to perform their best. So what I do is I just use some of the plant tone, and I fertilize those perennials either once a month or every 2 weeks. Depends on how they look. So generally, if your plants are performing well, if they are green, if they're producing a lot of flowers, they don't need that much fertilizer. Now, if your plants are stunted, they kind of look sickly, they don't produce that many flowers, there's probably some nutrients missing from the soil. And in this case, I will take a quick pause and talk about soil testing. So if your plants do not look good, it is time to test your soil, because there are probably some nutrients missing. And you don't want to over-fertilize your soil either, because what happens is your plants will just become really leggy, like I mentioned. They will have this really fat, succulent growth and don't produce a lot of flowers for you. And secondly, you will be polluting our environment. So the excess fertilizer will run into the stormwater and go into our watershed. And I'm sure you've heard all these horror stories about algae bloom. So algae bloom a lot of times is caused by fertilizer runoff, and nobody wants that. I do my soil testing every couple of years in different spots of the garden to see if I'm missing some nutrients, or if there's too much organic matter. We don't want that either. And then you can address what you need with the fertilizer. The soil test will also tell you about your pH, and a lot of times the way your plants absorb the nutrients is pH dependent. So you kind of need that information anyway. Now let me talk about the native plants a little bit more. So the prairie type native plants like the switchgrass or the little blue stem or bee balms, they do not like a lot of fertilizer, and they do prefer to grow in poor soil, otherwise they will split. But there are certain native plants, like the ones that grow in the woods, they love more rich soil. So those, like the ferns or a lot of native ephemerals like trilliums, for example, they love that rich humusy layer of soil. And those native perennials, I definitely amend more with compost, fallen leaves in the fall, or again, chop and drop or wood chips. Let's talk about vegetables now. Vegetables, as we know, are heavy feeders because we want them to produce a lot of fruit. So the way I treat my vegetable garden is, again, I amend the soil early in the spring with compost, and then I fertilize my vegetables once a month to every few weeks. Again, I look at the plant. Are the plants performing well? Are they fruiting well? Do they look yellow? So definitely pay attention to the way your plant looks too, because you don't want to over fertilize. And in the vegetable garden, I use garden tone. I use about 1/3 of a cup per plant. And as for the vegetables, some of them are also more of the heavy feeders, and some don't prefer too much of the fertilizer. So like the tomatoes and the cucumbers, those need a lot of food, so I fertilize those regularly. Another group of plants that I fertilize regularly during the growing season are houseplants. And I know we don't even want to think about houseplants this time of the year, but I love them, and I love how they make me happy during the winter. So I want to make them happy during the growing season. So I fertilize my houseplants with this Dr. Earth liquid fertilizer. I start fertilizing them in the spring when they have new growth, and then I fertilize them every couple of weeks, and then about once a month during the summer. So as long as they're putting out a lot of new growth, I continue to fertilize. And then around October time, when they go into dormancy, I stop fertilizing. And I really like this fertilizer for the houseplants because it does not smell bad. So I don't know if you've ever tried Neptune fertilizer, which is great, but it just smells so bad, and you don't want any of that inside your home. This is it as for the different plants that I have in my garden and how I fertilize them. But here are some tips. Tip number 1 is to make sure that your plants are well watered before you fertilize them. That is not as important if you're using organic fertilizer, but is definitely important if you're using synthetic fertilizer, because as I mentioned, you can burn your plants. Number 2 is to test your soil to see if you're missing certain nutrients, or let's say you have excess of some nutrients. Soil tests will also show the pH level of your soil. So for example, our soil here in northern New Jersey is about 6, which is really good. Plants can uptake a lot of nutrients at that pH level. But I have this gardenia here to my right that has been in the pot for a very long time, and I know the acidity of the soil there has changed and it has chlorosis. So what I did, I fertilized that gardenia with Hollytone fertilizer, which is a fertilizer for acidic loving plants. And just 2 weeks later, the new leaves are already green, and they've changed that classic appearance of chlorosis to green color. So that definitely worked. Tip number 3 is to always follow the instructions on the label. Don't over-fertilize your plants because you can burn them. You can create a lot of extra runoff into our watershed. And why would you waste a fertilizer? The bottom line is just watch your plants. If they're not performing as well, if they're stunted, yellowing, they're not blooming as much, there's something going on and they probably need a fertilizer. And by the way, I will post links to all of these fertilizers in the description down below. I also recently created Amazon storefront for all of the garden products that I use in my garden, because I constantly get questions about the products that I use. So you can go straight there. It's all categorized by fertilizer, weeding, staking, and all of the other things that I do in my garden. But I hope this video has been helpful for you and you learned something new. And I will see you next one.